this, you know, you can easily trace it back to, let's say, 1953. That was a key year. That was the year the U.S. government overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran. And of course, I mean, that's an interesting phenomenon, right? Because we hear so much about how bad Iran is these days. But in fact, it had a democratic government in the early 50s. But that democratic government, very popular government, was headed by a guy, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who nationalized the country's oil industry, the foreign-owned oil industry, which was extremely popular with the people of Iran. Very unpopular, however, with the big British and American oil companies and with the British and American government. So after a couple of years of this nationalization, the U.S. and Britain and the oil companies organized this boycott of Iranian oil to try and bring Iran to its knees. They failed. So after the 2 years, they still couldn't do it. The CIA went in and orchestrated a coup, actually overthrew that democratically elected government. Now, of course, that was a terrible tragedy for the people of Iran. But I mean, then the U.S. replaced Mossadegh with the brutal tyrant, the Shah. And the impact of that is very interesting. I mean, not only did Iran become a horrible dictatorship where it had been really quite a progressive democracy, but what ends up happening is the Shah is so brutal and so repressive that he allows absolutely no dissent whatsoever. So anybody wanting to even so much as attend a meeting, the only place you can do that actually is in the mosques. So, the mosques become kind of the meeting place. And they become, it's not hard to see how they become a kind of a center for a kind of potent mix of, anti-Shah, anti-American feeling mixed with a certain amount of, religious fundamentalism. And so it's easy to see how that, eventually, that became a very potent mix, eventually led to the overthrow of the Shah and the rise of a kind of a militant anti-American government in Iran, not to mention that ideology spreading throughout the Middle East. So when 9/11 happened, there's this kind of shock among Americans, like, why do they hate us so? Well, the only reason they don't know is because their media has blocked out every part of the story until the planes strike on 9/11. If you knew any of that history, you wouldn't have any trouble understanding why there was such rage in that part of the country. So I mean, the striking thing is, like with, apart from Ron Paul in that debate, you simply never hear that kind of critique in the American media, or for that matter in the Canadian media. I mean, you hear plenty of criticism of, let's say, the war in Iraq, but the criticism is always, they didn't send enough troops in. They didn't have enough planning. Bush botched it somehow. But there's never any sense, you have the feeling that in fact, if the war had succeeded and everything had gone smoothly, everyone would think it was terrific. There's no sense that it was absolutely wrong, that it was contrary to international law, it was morally wrong to invade another country. In fact, the implication is, even in the commentaries you hear now, and this was very much the case with, remember Ignatieff last summer wrote that sort of mea culpa in the New York Times magazine, which was ostensibly all about, he made a mistake supporting the war in Iraq. He clearly wanted to get that out of the way so he could eventually become Prime Minister of Canada. He knew that was necessary. But in fact, if you read it carefully, there's no real criticism of the war in Iraq at all, except for poor planning. There's certainly no suggestion that the motives, in fact, he suggested the motives of the Bush administration are honorable. And as so many of these commentators do, the notion is, these are good motives. It just, it just didn't come off very well. And this is why, of course, even now, when you're talking about the war in Iraq, you still cannot, mention oil. because, you know, that would suggest there was a bad motive. That would suggest that, you know, the fact that Iraq has the largest unharvested oil bonanza left on earth, you know, was of interest to people like Dick Cheney or George Bush. You know, you can't suggest that. And similarly, in the Manley report, it's quite striking. You know, they talk about this, when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, they refer to that as the Soviet invasion and occupation. But when the Americans and us are there, it's not an invasion occupation. We're helping. You know, we're helping the people over there. Now, of course, you know, if my guess is that, you know, the reason the media does this is that, you know, certainly if Americans ever had a sense of the real story, the real history of all this, you know, they might start to question their country's foreign policy. I mean, not only is it totally immoral and out of control, it's also, you know, potentially devastating to their own self-interest, and that it creates what, in fact, the CIA calls blowback, you know, angry responses. And it is absolutely striking when you think about it that, you know, even after 9/11, all these years after 9/11, we still have not had any kind of meaningful debate about the legitimacy of American foreign policy. It's not even a subject that's ever discussed. It simply doesn't come up. Except, as I say, as it pertains to whether or not the planning was good, or limited issues like that. And so, because they don't want to get at those deeper questions of America's role in the world and the legitimacy of that role, they redefine the issue as Islam attacking the West. And of course, that's very convenient, because then Islam becomes the new enemy. You know, and they've needed a new enemy ever since the Soviet enemy disappeared, right? So this just fits in perfectly. And in fact, it is this war against Islam that Canada is very much being dragged into. You know, when I was working on this book, I had a kind of fascinating experience. I attended a conference at the War College here, the Canadian War College here in Toronto. And well, it wasn't exactly a secret meeting, but it hadn't really been, there was no other media there. I was the only media. And I sort of thought, geez, this is interesting. You know, it was like all these soldiers and some think tank people, and thought, you know, maybe if I kind of make myself invisible, you know, they'll talk kind of more openly than they might. So I sat in the back row and kind of pulled my burqa more tightly around myself. And it was quite interesting. Now, listen, they had this General Thomas Metz up from the U.S., from Fort Hood, Texas. He'd been over to Iraq. And he was going on and on about, you know, how dangerous the Muslim world is. And he was talking about, you know, there's 1 billion Muslims in the world. And he made the point, he said, you know, he said, if only 1% of those Muslims, those 1 billion Muslims, only 1% are radical. That's 10 million radical Muslims. And he was creating this kind of scary image of these flaming, crazy people coming over to kind of destroy our way of life here in the West. So it was going on and on like that, and then the weirdest thing happened. Just all of a sudden, in the middle of his presentation, he switches gears completely, and he starts talking about the U.S. dependence on oil.